Good morning. I'm Harry Chapman, Lighthouse Counsel Senior Consultant, broadcasting live from our offices in Franklin, Tennessee. On behalf of Lighthouse Counsel and our co-host partner, Virtuous, welcome to the Giving USA 2023 briefing. Giving USA is the longest running and most comprehensive report on the sources and uses of charitable giving in America. It's published by the Giving USA Foundation, a public service initiative of the Giving Institute, of which Lighthouse Counsel and Virtuous are proud members. Today, you'll hear from one of Giving USA's lead researchers, who will break down the recently released Giving USA 2023 report and provide critical insights on current economic developments and donor trends. Dr. Una Osili, Associate Dean for Research and International Programs with the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, is a global expert on philanthropy and social innovation. She has more than 2 decades of experience in leadership, economic policy, and research across public and private sectors. She speaks across the globe on issues related to national and international trends in economics and philanthropy, and is frequently quoted in international and national news media outlets such as NPR, the New York Times, Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and many others. The nonprofit Times named her to the list of 50 most influential people in the nonprofit sector in 2019, 20, and 21. Following will be a panel discussion with leading global experts on philanthropy, moderated by Erik Tomalis, who is Director of Business Development at Virtuous. Virtuous is responsible for fundraising software platform proven to help nonprofit organizations increase generosity by serving all your donors personally, no matter the gift size. It streamlines your team's work, eliminates tedious back office tasks, and focuses on the relationships and connections. Lighthouse Counsel and Virtuous welcome and appreciate all the speakers and panelists participating today and look forward to hearing the insights this morning. Now, I'd like to welcome Dr. Una Osili, coming to you live from Indiana University.
Welcome, everyone. It is a joy and a delight and really an honor to be with you and to share these latest results. As many of you know, the Lilly Family School is the world's first school on philanthropy, and we partner with the Giving USA Foundation every year. But this year was a monumental year for our work because, as all of you know, we've been through a global pandemic, racial and social justice movement, and also ongoing economic and geopolitical challenges. So our team took extra time this year, not just to compile and calculate all the results, but also to place the results in context. And to prepare for this webinar, I actually went back and reviewed all the Giving USAs in the 50s, in the 60s, and even in the 70s. So I will share with you some of that context today. I'm also thrilled that we have so many wonderful panelists who will share their insights, and special thanks to Lighthouse Counsel for hosting us this morning. So I'm going to start with sharing my screen here, and I want to make sure everybody can see from the beginning. What we do every year at the Lilly Family School is take all the data from Giving USA, which is quite a bit, more than 10,000 data points, and we try to distill those into the 10 key findings. So today I'll be providing those key findings, but also I will provide the context, what philanthropy looks like now, and also what's next. Giving USA is the longest running report on charitable giving. And I'm going to start with the big picture. What have we learned from all our work on Giving USA? Because our work starts from the time the report is published until the next one is launched. So the first bit of news is a bit of a big headline. Giving levels for 2022, the latest data that we have is $499 billion. But that data actually represents a decline of 3.4%. To place these numbers in context, we are now at an all-time high in giving, but 2022 did represent a decline given that the pandemic year 2020 and 2021 were record years for giving. Now, in addition to the large number that I shared, but also the decline, I want to emphasize how giving has changed in the time that we've been studying charitable giving. The big picture here is that individuals still make up the lion's share of American philanthropy at 64%. But when we rewind the tape and look back in the 1980s, a very interesting time because as we know, the 80s also had quite a bit of economic uncertainty. Individual giving was 81%. And if we looked even further back in the 50s and 60s, individual giving was even higher at 85 and almost 90%. So the big news, what's changed is that individuals are a smaller slice of the pie, but they still remain the lion's share of American philanthropy. The takeaway for everyone joining us today is success relies on developing relationships with individuals. What's changed since the 50s and the 60s and even the 70s and 80s is the foundation slice of the pie. As we look back, if you look in the 1980s, a time of high inflation, the oil shocks, many of the economic issues and shocks that we see today, foundations occupy just 5% of American philanthropy. Today, foundations make up the largest slice they've ever had on record at 21% of American philanthropy. I want to emphasize also that half of the foundation segment is made up of family foundations. Family foundations are important to note because they tend to be small, tend to be staffed relatively low on the staffing with maybe one staff member, mostly run by family members. So in some ways, building relationships with family foundations is very similar to dealing with individuals. Charitable bequests, as you will know, now make up 9% of all giving. That's very similar to their share in the 1980s. As we look at the United States population and the demographic trends that are taking place, we also note that we have an aging demographic. Many of our seniors are reaching their peak giving years, and they're also beginning to plan for legacy gifts. So the takeaway from this data is that if you had to add the individual segment, half of the foundation segment, and all of the bequests, you would still have that 85% of giving is attributed to individuals, whether living or deceased. And then finally, let's turn our attention to corporations. Corporations made news in the past few years for their unprecedented generosity. Many corporations stepped up in the wake of the COVID crisis to address needs in their communities, both at a local level, but also at a global level. We've seen corporations respond to crises, disasters, local and national, and more recently with the war in Ukraine, many corporate donors have also stepped up. It's also worth noting that corporate giving, while it looks very similar between the 1980s and today's numbers at 5-6% of all giving, is an area of change. Corporations have become more strategic in their philanthropy. They're also using new tools and vehicles, impact investing being one of them. We're seeing many corporations lean into sponsorships and marketing. Some of those dollars fall outside of our traditional corporate philanthropy. So if I had to put it all together today, I would say that corporate giving, while those numbers look relatively stable, there has been tremendous change over time. Another big insight from looking at this data in this big picture lens is that giving by individuals over the last 40 years has grown at about a 5% annualized rate over the last 40 years. But the rate of growth for foundations has been double that at 9.2%. So as all of us are looking at these numbers, one important message is the role that individuals play, but also understanding that individuals today have a number of vehicles that they can use. They can certainly give through their own personal pocketbooks or checkbooks. They can give through their foundation dollars if they have family foundations. Charitable bequests are an important part of that picture. And then some individuals may work within corporations where corporate dollars, especially those matching dollars, become quite significant. So as we look at the second big picture finding from Giving USA this year, and our team spent a lot of time with this data, We also see that the map of giving is shifting following the pandemic era. Religious congregations still receive the lion's share of gifts. So if you look at the destination of American philanthropy, religious congregations are still the largest destination. However, it's quite clear that during the pandemic, we've had quite a bit of shifting taking place. Human services, while consistently in the lead as far as destination areas, has now reached the second largest recipient category for charitable giving at 14%. Education, which used to be number 2, has fallen slightly because human services did receive quite record numbers of large gifts and small gifts during the pandemic era. Now, I just also want to mention, because I have had this benefit of looking at the data over time, that 2 of the subsectors today that we study very closely did not exist in the 50s and 60s. The environment as a subsector was so small that it wasn't characterized until 1987. Similarly, giving to international affairs, which has received a lot of attention with the war in Ukraine, now makes up 6% of charitable giving. And back in the 50s and 60s was not a separate subsector because Americans did not give on the whole as much as they do today to international causes. So the pandemic era has led to more awareness about human services, about basic needs, about needs of the most vulnerable in our society. And so some of that shifting is evidenced in the data today. Now that I have shared this big picture with these key findings, I'd like to take you behind the scenes to understand the giving context, how it's changing, and what it means for your organization. If you had to think about what explains the trends we've seen, especially during the pandemic and in the past year, we would say that the economy has been one of the strongest predictors of giving over time. And when we look, especially over the last 2 decades, we note that the giving trends are very much linked with overall the stock market, GDP trends, and many other factors. However, when we look at recessions in particular, so zeroing in on the impact of recessions on giving, one takeaway here is that you've seen one recession. In other words, in some recessions that we've studied, giving has not fallen, actually. A good example of that is 2020, the pandemic year, where we did have a recession. Unemployment was at record levels. Many other indicators took a hit. But by the end of the year, the stock market had recovered. There was a lot of optimism following the vaccine rollouts. And what we saw is record levels of charitable giving take place towards the end of the year, even though that was considered a recession year. So the message I have for all of you is, even with all the questions and concerns about economic uncertainty and how it will affect donors, the key is that organizations that maintain and build relationships with their donors actually have the best chance of navigating an economic crisis. To that point, the past 2 years have had some of the highest levels of giving ever recorded, with giving reaching and exceeding the $500 trillion mark in 2021. Why did we have this slight decline following these peak records of giving? The big message here is the role that inflation played. Some of you have been following this. Inflation, which was not part of many of us, our consciousness for quite some time, has now reached very high levels. In 2022, inflation reached an 8% rate, which meant that many organizations, even if they were raising the same amount of money, were not able to experience a real increase. In other words, their rates did not keep pace with the 8% inflation rate. Inflation has consequences for donors. Households give when they have the financial and economic means to give, with higher prices for food, for energy, for housing, for healthcare. Many everyday donors did see a significant impact of inflation on their ability to make gifts, but we also had a decline in the stock market at the end of 2022. So the second, number 4 finding here, part of our top 10 list, the second aspect of studying 2022 is to understand that 2022 had both economic challenges, but also some strengths. So let's start with some of those challenges. And you'll notice a theme here, especially in 2023 and beyond. First, inflation reached 8%. This is the highest rate in 40 years. We have not had this level of inflation. And many nonprofits are adjusting to what this means for how they do their work. But it wasn't just inflation. The stock market also declined, actually 25%, adjusting for inflation. If we put it all together, for many households, disposable personal income also declined in this period. However, there were some bright spots as we look at 2022. Let me mention some of them. Unemployment. Many households were finding that they had ample job opportunities. We had very low unemployment rates, and the year ended with positive GDP growth. And despite fear and risk of recession, we did not fall into a recession in 2022. So there remains a lot of interest in studying the economy, even in 2023 and beyond. We still hear the threat of a recession continues. But the good news here is that even in these difficult times, Americans have maintained a commitment to generosity. We saw record giving rates during the pandemic. Not only did donors give, but they stepped up their giving, and we saw many new forms and ways of giving emerge. Now, let's look at those sources of giving. As I mentioned, inflation was a big factor for 2022. And this means that when we take inflation into account, all of the sources of giving that we study did not keep pace with inflation. However, when we look at the 2-year growth rates between 2021 and 2022, we note that corporations and foundations did especially well. Let me start with corporate giving. Corporations had really strong giving experiences during the pandemic. Following the pandemic, we saw companies bounce back in terms of their corporate pre-tax profits. And we also saw a renewed and a resurgence of companies making commitments to the communities that they located in, where their markets are, where their customers are. This includes a lot of the big announcements around racial equity and racial justice, but we've also seen innovative forms of, especially workplace giving, formed, and corporate partnerships with nonprofits. Foundations are also worth noting here because during the pandemic, we saw family foundations, especially many of them introduced more flexible forms of grant making. On average, Foundation Source, Candid, other data sets that track foundation giving actually saw that foundations were paying out above their required 4 or 5% rates. Some of them also introduced what we have now started to call trust-based philanthropy models, flexible multi-year grants, allowing their grantees to have more ownership and more say in how those grants are structured. Now, let's look at where we did see significant declines. The individual segment was by far the perhaps weakest link in the chain, as it were. And you'll note that individual giving had the steepest decline, the sharpest decline. Some of that is that the economy played a role. We've also seen that many individuals are still navigating the role of inflation, and then a weaker performance in the stock market meant that those end of the year gifts also took some declines. So that is the big picture for 2022. You can see a bit of a mixed picture with bright spots around foundations and corporate giving. So with all of this data, we now have an opportunity to do a bit of a look ahead. What is ahead for the nonprofit sector with the role of the economy, with many of the geopolitical factors that we've already discussed, but also understanding that a consistent theme in all the years that Giving USA has been produced, which is, as we said, going back to the 50s, is the generosity of Americans in the face of all of these challenges. So let's look at those opportunities. By far, the biggest opportunity remains individual giving. Why? During the pandemic, we did see not just large gifts announced, but also that everyday Americans stepped up in their giving, and many embraced new ways of giving. In this recent period, we have seen this decline in giving, but we've also noted that when we look at the data more closely, it's also clear that where the decline is coming from often is from individuals that perhaps have lower incomes, less educated. We see a bit of the diploma divide as it relates to charitable giving. The message here is that nonprofits need to look at their data and ensure that they're building the most inclusive and diverse donor segments that they can. We know that large gifts are accounting for a bigger share of the overall pie. In fact, for the last 2 years, large gifts by individuals have represented about 5% of all giving. This is the second year in a row. This includes donors like McKinsey Scott. We know that not only have they set the pace for giving, McKinsey Scott announced $6 billion alone in 2020. What's also interesting about this individual segment is that individuals with McKinsey Scott in the lead here have also announced new ways of giving. All of the gifts that McKinsey Scott made in 2020 were unrestricted, and that pattern has continued. The organizations that received those gifts did not have any restrictions imposed on them. Now, here is the opportunity and the call to action for all of you who are joining. Although Americans have remained and maintained their commitment to charitable giving, we've also seen declines in the participation rates in charitable giving. At the beginning of the 21st century, 2/3 of American households gave, and that actually increased during crises, almost to 70%. We've seen around the time of the Great Recession, the fraction of Americans that participate in charitable giving declined, and that has continued. More close to our discussion and germane to our discussion today, we have also tracked the share of household income that goes to charitable giving. In fact, this is a metric that our team has been analyzing quite closely for the past 2 decades. And what we've seen is despite the growth that took place in charitable giving, this fraction of how much Americans give to charity has remained virtually the same at 2% of their household income. In other words, while the fraction that we spend on food, on entertainment, on travel, on technology has grown, the fraction that we have allocated to charitable giving as Americans has remained stubbornly at 2%. So the challenge I want to issue to everyone joining us today is, what would we have to do differently as a sector to move the needle beyond 2%? How can we inspire our donors to think about giving more to charitable giving? To the nonprofits and to the causes that matter to them? What role does public policy have in moving this needle? And then finally, what can donors do, even as individuals, to ensure that they can allocate more than 2%? If you think about what the standard should be, the biblical mandate is 10%, and even in other religious traditions, Islam, 2.5% of your income should go to the needy. So we're a long way away from any of those targets. Now, as I mentioned, giving by corporations was a bright spot in the past few years. Corporations have had the strongest growth rates of all the 4 sources of charitable giving, and corporate giving, as we mentioned, often is linked to the performance of corporations in terms of corporate pre-tax profits. So as we look back at the last few years, we've seen enormous growth in corporate giving. Many companies have expanded the ways that they're engaging in charitable giving, understanding that this can be a valuable way of engaging their employee base, retaining talent, and building close relationships within their community. However, there is also a challenge embedded in this data, and I'd like to share that today, another call to action. When we look back at the Giving USA data over time, there's a bit of a surprise here. In the 1960s and 70s, corporations gave a larger share of their corporate pre-tax profits to nonprofits at almost 2% back in the 60s, 70s, and even in the 80s. Now, over time, we've seen this share actually decline. It's now under 1%. So another call to action, what could we do differently to move this needle beyond this 1% threshold? I do get some pushback when we share this data. Some have shared that actually corporations are doing more. It may not be all through the corporate philanthropy bucket. They may be also allocating dollars through sponsorships, marketing partnerships. Many of you know about the Tom shoes and many other ways that companies are giving. So I still think there is a role for consumers, for employees, for corporate leaders to play in changing this picture over time and thinking about how more of those dollars can also be allocated through the corporate philanthropy bucket. As we look over time, there's also one other quick element to mention, that workplace campaigns have been a big part of how nonprofits have engaged with companies. However, workplace campaigns are changing because of the demographic shifts we're seeing, the fact that many employees are remote workers today, contingent workers, part-time workers, and the types of industries are changing. Overall, we do see that when employees have a favorable view of nonprofits, they're more likely to participate. But there's a big demographic, both challenge and opportunity. Older workers, older employees are more likely to give through the workplace than their younger counterparts. So many nonprofits are really struggling with how do they engage with these workplace donors. Another statistic and data point that has been so compelling for our team is that for many companies, only 25% of the dollars they allocate for matching are actually secured by nonprofits. In other words, companies are putting out these dollars, but the employees are not securing them. So for those nonprofits who are joining today, who are fundraisers, keep in mind that there are these corporate dollars that often go unused simply because employees do not request them. So we've shared the state of giving, we've shared the opportunities that lie ahead. Let's take a look even further out. We've shared data from 2022, but our team has also been in the field collecting data about 2023 and beyond. And so here I'm going to share what we've learned about what that future looks like and what all of you who are joining should know as you navigate 2023 and beyond. The big theme emerging from the data we've collected is the role of innovation and resilience. Nonprofits have had to pivot during the pandemic. We had groups like the CDC Foundation that did not have an individual giving program until COVID came, and they instituted their very first online crowdfunding campaign. So as we look ahead, nonprofits are going to have to innovate and navigate even more than they already have. Expanding individual giving means looking at all the different ways that individuals give, the modes they're using, the types of giving that's taking place, and also understanding that for the first time, online giving has now grown to occupy more than 10% of overall giving. So we've seen a lot of growth in social media fundraising, giving online, crowdfunding. In fact, our recent data collected during the pandemic shows that about 44% of Americans have either given via online crowdfunding campaigns or social media requests. So building the future pipeline of donors means engaging donors of all different backgrounds and meeting those donors where they are while providing tools and techniques that can affect and influence those donors. In addition, we used to talk about the 3 T's, time, talent, and treasure. Today, we understand that giving can be much broader than that, especially for younger donors. Younger donors think about sharing their voice, their testimony, using their social media influence, their ties and networks to support the causes that matter to them. And nonprofits, once again, have to meet those donors where they are. Finally, we live in a world that is so fast evolving that those of us in higher ed are having trouble keeping up. In the past year, new artificial intelligence techniques and tools such as ChatGPT are offering new opportunities for nonprofits and fundraisers, but also providing some challenges. We know that trust and engagement are the bedrock of philanthropy, and building trust online and through virtual modes can be challenging. But these are some of the opportunities as well as the innovations that will lie ahead. Now, finally, as we close out, I just want to say that this moment is like no other. We have data that allows us to understand all that's taking place in the philanthropic sector, but there have been a lot of surprises. And the biggest insight that our team has gleaned from looking at this data over the last few years is just the importance of not just reacting and responding to the challenges that lie ahead, but being able to look forward and see what lies ahead. And here, I'd love to hear your questions, your insights, and any surprises you see from the data. So I will stop here and pass it over to the moderator.
Thanks so much, Una, for sharing those valuable insights to help us better understand the Giving USA 2023 report and how to navigate the current philanthropic environment. Now we'll take a few questions from the audience. The first one, Una, is, has giving changed in similar ways during different historical times of economic uncertainty? For example, is it common for arts giving to decrease and social service giving to increase?
Very good. I'm so glad that question came up because our team has spent quite a bit of time looking at the Great Recession in particular, because it was, in fact, one of the most significant shocks that I certainly have experienced, and giving declined by about 15%. It took 6 to 7 years for giving to rebound. But what was also interesting about the recession is that the Great Recession is that different subsectors were affected in different ways. Specifically, human services, many donors shifted their giving portfolios to support human service organizations. And many of those same nonprofits saw that they had more interest in their work during the recession. In contrast, arts organizations were particularly affected by the Great Recession because high net worth donors and even everyday donors shifted their portfolios to actually allocate more to basic needs. During COVID, we saw some of that same pattern where human service organizations remained the priority for a lot of donors, and arts organizations suffered, not just because donors were reallocating their giving, but many arts organizations rely heavily on in-person fundraising, in-person events. Now, what we've learned is that those organizations have had to pivot. Pivot has been the key word. They've diversified their revenue streams, diversified their funding streams, and also learned to engage donors virtually. Another subsector that I think was affected during the pandemic was the health subsector. While it may seem like people were giving more to health organizations, many health organizations rely on runs and walks and in-person fundraising, and they've had to develop the American Cancer Society, Heart Association. They've had to develop new streams, new ways of fundraising. And this is what we mean by this is an era of innovation and resilience. And so I think the pattern that emerges is that certainly some subsectors are affected, but it's also an opportunity for those subsectors and those organizations to build these multiple streams of income and engage donors in different ways.
Great, thanks, Una. Would you be able to share some examples of how charities are using AI in their fundraising strategies?
Absolutely. So we have had a lot of, I'd say, sort of demos to kind of see how nonprofits are navigating ChatGPT. Now, one very interesting application has been in grant writing, fundraising appeals, and even donor responses. Many nonprofits are finding that they can use ChatGPT to get a first draft for a grant application or to customize fundraising appeals for different types of donors. But there's also a risk here. I will say from the examples I have seen, ChatGPT is certainly very powerful, but it's still an early stage set of applications. So I would recommend if you're going to use those tools, use them as a first draft. What we're finding is that organizations, funders are getting inundated with proposals. And so So
Oh, wow.
having an average proposal is not going to be sufficient. And so while ChatGPT can generate a proposal that perhaps can be submitted, it may not be the one that will stand out to the funder. So where this is very helpful is in providing a first draft, providing sort of a template that you can then use. But keep in mind, these technologies are developing very rapidly. The demos and presentations we've had suggest that these innovations are not years away, they're days away and months away. And so really, probably by next year, many of these applications will be part of our everyday work. But keep in mind that once again, what helps build those individual relationships are the trust that nonprofits can imbue their donors with. And while technology can be a valuable tool, it cannot be a replacement for building those authentic and engaged relationships.
Great. And one final question. With the 30 trillion generational transfer of wealth beginning to occur, what impact do you anticipate? When is that transfer estimated to be complete? Clearly, engaging the next generation in giving is key. So what's that window of opportunity?
Very good question. The transfer is already taking place. We're finding that as our oldest cohort kind of moves into that transition period, many of them are already turning over the reins of their estates, their assets to the younger family members. However, another interesting trend is that Americans are living longer. So that life expectancy that many thought would be in the 70s is now much longer. So that also means that you have to think about this wealth transfer quite differently. It's not a 0-1 type of relationship. It's something that's going to happen over time, maybe over decades. But what I have found interesting, especially in the family foundation domain, is that some older donors are actually bringing in the younger family members at an earlier point and giving them a lot more responsibility and leadership in the family foundations. So for nonprofits, for organizations that are working with those family members, approaching this with this lens of multi-generation family members and getting to understand those family dynamics if you're going to work with those families and bringing the younger generation to the table where necessary.
Well, thank you again so much, Una. We really appreciate you joining us. Harry, back to you.
Thank you, Susan. And thanks for all your questions. And again, thanks, Una, for your participation today. We really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us. Next, let's move into the panel discussion on philanthropy, moderated by Erik Tomalis. Erik is a proven fundraising professional that is forward-thinking, people-driven, but most of all, results-oriented. With over 20 years of fundraising experience, he has made thousands of face-to-face donor solicitations, raising millions of dollars for many nonprofit organizations, such as St. Jude's Children's Hospital and the Boy Scouts of America, among others. Erik understands how nonprofits can grow global generosity through responsive fundraising. Erik?
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever everyone is. Appreciate that discussion, and thank you so much to Una and to the Giving Institute. Jumping into the introduction of our panel, we have an all-star panel. I'm really excited for this discussion that we have around the horn. I'm going to do a quick little introductions, and then we'll jump right into some of these key questions. The first person I want to introduce is my friend Marco Corona. He's our Senior Development Officer for the Southern Environmental Law Center in Charleston, South Carolina. He has over 20 years as a nonprofit professional, including 17 years in direct fundraising. He builds and strengthens donor relations to defend and protect the environment and advance a healthier climate. How amazing is that? He previously led development for the International Affair, African American Museum, and 180 Place. Thank you, Marco, for joining us. Appreciate you. Christy Eckoff, she's our SVP and Senior Trust Advisor at Wells Fargo Private Bank here in Atlanta, Georgia. She's an expert on trusts and estate law, impact investing, and philanthropic giving vehicles. Previously, Christy served as Chief Foundation Officer at the Atlanta Jewish Foundation and Managing Director and Philanthropic Counsel at the Community Foundation in Greater Atlanta, and served as Senior Director of Gift Planning at Georgia State. Lots of experience with Christy as well. Thank you so much for being here. My friend Kevin, he's in Houston. He's his SVP Development and Public Affairs and Chief Development Officer at UT Health Science Center in Houston. It's air conditioned where he is, everyone. Just want to let everyone know that. He leads the fundraising program for the most comprehensive academic health center in the UT system and the U.S. Gulf Coast region. Joining the organization in 2012, he has increased annual commitments from $25 million to over $60 million. As well, he serves as the immediate past chair for the Association Fundraising Professionals Global Board. Thank you, Kevin, for being here. Abigayle Tobia, she is a VP of Philanthropy at Verlant in Sewickley, PA. That's actually Pittsburgh. Prior to joining Verlant, Abigayle led the North Allegheny Foundation as the executive director, where she quadrupled funds raised there. And she also did it again here at Verlant. Abigayle also played a vital role on the fundraising teams at Cherokee National Historic Society, Girl Scouts Western PA, and the Price Tower Arts Center. Throughout her more than 20 years of fundraising experience, Abigayle has also raised millions of dollars for a variety of organizations' mission. Thank you, Abigayle. And finally, we have Harold Witherspoon. He's also another Boy Scout as well. He's the Executive Director of Development at the Salvation Army in Nashville, has over 30 years of experience, including 21 with the Boy Scouts of America in various leadership roles, and has always included fund relationship development. Prior to his work in Memphis, he was the development director at Memphis Child Advocacy Center. Welcome to you all. Thank you. Appreciate everyone for joining into this discussion. But I want to kick it off with one kickoff question for the entire panelists, if you can. And we can just kind of do a round robin or around the horn to see who wants to answer first. But we've heard an incredible amount of generosity for 2022, $499 billion. That's with a billion dollars. While a decline from the record-breaking amount given last year, this is still above pre-pandemic levels. And in 2023, there continues to be a lot of volatility affecting giving. You know, the inflation, shrinking donor pool, the mega gifts, technology advancements. Now that we're halfway through 23, I mean, what's the downward trend from 22 going to continue? Is it going to happen, or are we going to change the course as an institution? I'll leave it up to whoever wants to jump in first.
Well, I'll go ahead. Go ahead, Harold.
No, Abigayle, you go first.
All right. So I will start with, we did not experience the decline in 2022, and we're not seeing a decline in 23. I do think that we haven't seen our donors factor in inflation in their donations. And so we haven't tested that. Inflation hit us too. Would you give 10% more because our costs have increased 10%? We haven't actually tested that kind of conversation. But I do think that the pandemic, especially in a healthcare related field that focus on individuals that were very vulnerable, we just saw a deepening relationship with our donors and our caretakers and our leaders in our community. It really opened up some meaningful conversations, and that impacted their ongoing generosity towards our mission and our important work.
Great. That's great. Harold, I know you wanted to answer.
Thank you. No, I'd say this: from the social service sector, we saw the increases during the pandemic. You know, everyone felt like, hey, they need help because they're helping more people. We increased capacity, did a lot of things with government funding that was being pushed down as well. We saw our budget double during the pandemic, which was pretty interesting because that also told us how many more people we were serving that needed help. Now what we're seeing is the decrease. Now we're feeling the decline now. I think the decline started for others last fiscal year. We're seeing it now. We're down about 15% overall in giving. Our biggest decline is in direct marketing, direct mail. That's about 26%. So you're seeing those donors that were through acquisition maybe some other donors that were coming because of the need, and they felt compelled to give on that particular appeal that hit the mailbox.
Mm-hmm.
But now you're seeing that decline happen. But what we're seeing the increase is in planned giving. You have more of the donors that are supporting the Salvation Army beginning to put us in a planned gift. We're an older organization. We have a donor base that is a baby boomer heavy donor base, I would say. But we are growing in the digital space. We're only down 3% in digital giving right now, but we've grown our digital giving over the past 5 years astronomically. So I see us now challenged with, in the social service space, beginning to figure out where are those other investors going to come from to help us maintain some capacity we were able to gain during the pandemic.
Harold, let me just quickly follow up on that, because, I mean, we just saw the report from the Giving USA, and we're comparing today's numbers to the pre-pandemic. And you talked about how you saw the decline from this past year. Is it from this past year or from pre-pandemic numbers?
We've been planning around as far as budget planning, we're looking at 2019 as a baseline, expense and revenue. That made more sense to us because we saw such a increase in those next 2 years. But again, that increase had a lot to do with perceived and real need by the public. And so now that perceived and real need, there's still a real need, but the perceived need is starting to drop because the type of promotion of the need is not there. So we as an organization are really looking inside to our historical donors and beginning to really talk with those major donors about what the real needs are.
Great. And I guess it goes, I mean, I just want to say too, it goes without saying, thank you to all the fundraisers out there, because Harold, you hit a great point. The fact the need is important for our community, and the work everyone here on the panel and the attendants that are attending here, the work you guys do is important, and it's valuable for all of us. So thank you on behalf of Virtuous and Lighthouse and all the people on the other side serving nonprofits. Christy, I'd love to.
So it's very interesting what Harold was saying, because I work with high net worth families around their entire wealth and not just philanthropy anymore. So it's a very interesting conversations that we're having right now. Number one, even though, these people are very wealthy, they're very worried about inflation, hugely worried about it. And they, believe it's going to affect their lifestyle and, their spare money, so to speak. They're also very worried about the stock market. It's not going to be the go-go, 2010s like we saw for, a while with, 15, 20%, 25% growth. And so the conversations we're having with people is, how do they retrench? How do they figure, all this out that's going on at this point? And so we're seeing a lot of people pull back to their pre-pandemic giving. We're seeing people kind of really examine, what they're doing. Is it having an impact? Are these organizations stewarding them well? And if they're not, they're kind of taking them off the list. They're really shortening that list of places where they're kind of willing to put their dollars. And they're looking for ways to do this differently. Most very wealthy people can't use the tax deduction that they get for a lot of these really mega gifts. So how else are you able to give them a way to invest in your organization? And they're really seeing it now as an investment and not a gift.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. And then going to what Harold was saying around plain giving, there's a huge opportunity right now. The estate taxes are probably going to be cut. Exemptions are going to be cut in half probably beginning in 2026. So we're starting to have those conversations with our clients now about, what are you going to do about that? How are you going to set up your assets so that, you're not going to be impacted by this great reduction in the estate tax exemption? And charities have a real opportunity right now to start talking about plain giving and those opportunities that you've got.
That's great feedback, Christy. Thank you for sharing that. And it looks like, Kevin, you came off mute too.
Yeah, Christy, I think you brought up a great point, which is that shortening of the list. And it's something that we think about all the time is like, how do you stay in the top 3? Because when we see these ups and downs in the economy or with inflation, that seems to be a common thread, right? If a donor has this list of 9 or 8 organizations that they tend to support, they do start to trim the tree a bit, and you want to be at that close in connection. So stewardship, so it's like really staying true to the things that we all know, right? Staying close to your donors, stay relevant, build relationships. For UT Health Houston, we've actually seen a great increase in our support this year. But again, it's staying true to what we do. We're in the middle of this post-pandemic era. We're a healthcare institution. We're focused on improving public health in our community. But also, as a sidebar, we're in a campaign. And so obviously, when you stay focused on a major fundraising initiative, you do have those large gifts that Una referenced that do make up a large percentage of our annual support. We've seen some really phenomenal support come in this year. We try to not get too dismayed by kind of the survey results in many ways, and just stay true to what you're doing, your mission, and making a difference in your community.
Yeah, I guess I'll kind of piggyback on that a little bit, just because I think just in terms of major donors, so I do have experience both, kind of what Harold was saying with the direct mail, but also with major donors this year. So last year I was with the International African American Museum, definitely saw a decline in terms of our direct mail, and we weren't hitting our projections. I think obviously, as people had some very tough decisions to make as to where they were going to place their dollars, charitable contributions were probably lower on their priority list than in previous years. And then secondly, in terms of major donors this year, I think some of the trend in just anecdotal, evidence or conversations that I've been having is, kind of there's donors who are coming off of a multi-year commitment or a capital campaign. And so they've really been, scaling back to meet those commitments first, and not really considering additional gifts or increase in their annual giving to other organizations. And I'll just, also just air a little bit of, I think, kind of my major concern, and I think what hopefully isn't catastrophic and doesn't have a catastrophic effect, but that shrinking donor pool has been happening for a while. Yes. And as development, and we have these two, as development departments work hard to keep up with their budgets, the obvious investment is in major gifts, which means that you're not investing as much into those lower level donors or those mid-level donors. And these are individuals who are often probably, in their 30s or 40s, young families, not a whole lot of expendable income, but at some point they may have that income. And to Kevin's point, in terms of the top 3, if you're not building that relationship now to be in their top 3 in 5 to 10 years, there's an opportunity that might be lost. And then the other factor, I think, with those annual donors or those lower level donors is there's according to the U.S. Census, the population is changing. Obviously, Black, Brown, and Asian populations are among the fastest growing demographics, and these individuals traditionally aren't in our philanthropic picture, and they're maybe not being asked the right way. And I think in order to raise funds from these communities, individuals need to see themselves reflected in the fundraisers who are asking them for money. And that's another big issue that I think, kind of our sector and our profession needs to, will need to address for sure.
Marco, you saw when you were talking, and you're talking about, I'm going to call it the generosity crisis, looking ahead of like, we're focused on the major gifts and we're not doing the acquisition. I just look around the room at our panel and every single one of us are nodding our head, because it's so true. It's that what's going to happen in 5 and 10 and 20 years to all these nonprofits that are focused on these short-term wins versus these long-term strategies, and being able to help do that. And it's a great segue into Kevin. I'd love to ask you, because you kind of led into it a little bit, with, as major and mega giving continues to grow and individual giving influences other constituency groups, family foundation, donor advised funds continue to grow. It appears that lower level donors are shrinking, right? That's what's happening. I mean, what are the tactics you guys have been doing to successfully employ over the past couple of years to, for your organization? Because you've seen that growth all over.
Yeah, Erik, thanks for that question. It's really interesting because I think oftentimes in our organizations, we're not nimble enough, and we need to do a better job of kind of pivoting and really reacting in a much quicker manner. But the reality is, especially for those entry-level donors, it's a schedule, right? You have your annual giving appeal schedule. It's built out a year and a half in advance, and you've got kind of all the operational things that go into place to get that up and running. And so if you want to make a shift, it takes a little while to impact that. However, I think what we're seeing is this more targeted appeals take place. You can't rely on this, I would say, a generational perspective where you just support the institution because it's a great institution, or you support the president's vision or CEO's vision. People want to see results. Donors want to see their response to their gift and how that impact is taking place. And I think our direct mail appeals have to speak to that in a more specific way. I think the challenge there is it's harder, right? Doing one general appeal for your institution, kind of easy. But if you start to segment and get really targeted and really start to show impact, I think it's a layer of challenge and resource allocation that has to take place. Una made the comment about AI and ChatGPT. That may be one angle we could look at to make things a little bit easier. I think there's challenges there as well. I think the other piece, not only with these targeted appeals, I think we also have to think about, Marco mentioned this focus on major gifts. We have to think about that more entry-level donor and how do we treat them as if they are major gift donors, because they are the major gift donors of the future. And so building out, one of the things we've done at UT is try to build out a lead annual giving officer role that really focuses on those next level donors. So treat the $500 donor or $1,000 donor with that more personal attention and care, because they are going to be the future major gift donor. So I do think rethinking how we manage our portfolios, not forgetting the fact that you do get these mega gifts that throw your numbers off in a really positive way. You've got to not forget those future donors of tomorrow, because I always say, we're paying it forward to those of us that are be on this panel 25 years from now, saying, thankfully, this group did all this well 25 years ago. So we need to thank our future selves.
Kevin, fantastic. I love that. I mean, just to compact that, personalization, connecting with donors, treating all our donors like major donors, right? Novel concepts that we should all be doing. How many of us are donating to organizations that we like and that we support? How do we want to be responsive to that? So love everything that you unpacked, and its opportunity to be able to support all nonprofits there. Thank you so much, Kevin. Marco, I'd love to kind of pivot a little bit and go over to ask you a little bit about foundation, giving, and you've seen a lot of success there. So, foundation giving has rose dramatically in 2022, and part of the continued family foundation giving that makes up 50% of total giving, right? In rising inflation costs, we heard from Una and Christy, and how in the interest rates, what would your recommendation be for securing foundation gifts in 2023?
So I think, to answer that question, I think taking a quick step back and, kind of really understanding why foundation giving has gone up so much, and family foundation giving in particular. And, Christy, will definitely correct me if I'm wrong, but, kind of one of the theories is that, during down economy, individuals will contribute stocks to family foundations to meet their philanthropic goals while offsetting their losses, right? So you got this stock, kind of it's taking a hit. Well, here's an opportunity to just put it in the family foundation and you feed two birds with one hand. So, or with one seed. So so knowing that, what is the major factor between, an individual donating to a family foundation instead of your charitable organization? And I think that's time. So individuals either run out of time to decide on who to donate to, and by donating to their family foundation, they're, almost quite literally buying more time. Or the appeals in front of them don't communicate a sense of urgency, right? There is, again, time is of the essence. Well, why should I give now? So the current economy, I think, has amplified this dynamic. So obviously, kind of this is an opportunity as people are, a lot of what Christy said, I'm just going to echo just in terms of, I think, individuals wanting to see, well, what is your impact? How can I make an impact? What is my philanthropic perspective or goals? What are they, right? These are the questions that I think individuals are starting to ask when they have a family foundation and at lower levels too, but specifically with family foundations. They're already pretty sophisticated in terms of, their philanthropy. So, knowing this, I would really recommend a strategy in which, one, you focus most of your efforts on family foundations with a single decision maker. So foundations that direct funds through a board or multiple layers of administration are hard nuts to crack and take up a lot of time. So really focusing on those family foundations that have, it's one person or a couple that's making the decision. It even just sort of with offsprings, it gets a little bit more difficult. But developing a relationship with a single person or couple is much easier. It's still a lot of work, but it provides an opportunity to truly understand the donor's interests and how you can help them meet the type of impact that they want to make in the world. Also, we're all in uncharted territory. This is a brave new world for all of us. And so, by developing a relationship, this is where we, the fundraisers, can really, maybe develop a relationship in which we're learning together, or we can advise, or we can be confidants in this, in their philanthropy. Two is focus your appeal on urgency. So don't be generic, articulate what you need funding for now. Again, with family foundations, or, kind of the question that people are asking, or the question that you should be answering, is not why they should give to you, but why should they give to you now, right now? Lastly, as just a general piece of advice, as we continue to move through rising inflation and interest rates, I would just advise everyone to, make sure that your budgets that you develop have a best, good, and worst case scenario projection, and communicate those clearly to your board and to anyone who should, who is, has skin in the game or has fiduciary responsibilities.
Great suggestions. Thank you, Marco. I even love the end part, was like the best, good, and great suggestion for board and for budgets. I think that's fantastic. That's a for-profit mentality that we're bringing into the nonprofit space of looking at forecasting and everything else. I think that great information as well. I remember when I was serving in the nonprofit space, I was in the middle of the pandemic, just like all of us. And I remember going back to our foundations and telling them, or asking them for their support, of saying, I know you have a minimum giving threshold and the percent that you're supposed to give, but there's no maximum. So let's go deeper and wider, and let's support as much as we can, especially, again, based on what you said, personalization, connectivity to the individual. Harold, I want to pivot a little bit and, kind of go toward that workplace giving. And for all of the folks that, are watching us right now, you can take a look around the room and just say, hey, who's working from home and who is working from an office based on their blazer that they're wearing or jacket that they're wearing. And so I want to lead into that workplace employee conversation of, like, with more employees working remotely, like myself right now, how have you seen the impact of workplace giving and volunteerism, and how do you believe that'll impact this year?
It's an interesting question for us. We have the world famous Angel Tree program. And so it is a good measuring stick for that, for us. Last year, this past holiday season, we saw our numbers go back up. We saw the companies that were working from home the last couple seasons come back. We have over 100 companies and organizations that partner with us for Angel Tree. About 2/3 of those, or about 1/3 of them, we kind of lost during that period. some big companies that went remote, and our liaisons with those companies share with us, we just can't get to the people. we don't know how to make that work. We know there are people that want to do it, but we can't get to them right now. Then we had other companies that came back sooner, and they were reaching out to us and saying, hey, when can we register? When can we sign up? We're ready to come back. And I think that was the testament to people wanting to get back to their normal, whatever that normal was, or the new normal. And the new normal has to have some things that resemble or feel like what the old normal was. And for us, the Angel Tree program, I think for a lot of these organizations, it's a team building activity for them. It's an opportunity to bring their departments together to do something that is going to be impactful in community. And it also brings their employees together so they see the why there's a support for the Angel Tree program or any other organization. We've been getting a lot of requests for group volunteer opportunities. Our challenge is having enough opportunities right now. So we're seeing sort of this return to wanting to be more engaged with the organizations that they're supporting financially, wanting to see and how to bring their employees back into this is the why, this is what the impact is for community. We're serving over 4,000 people with this program. Of those 100 companies, 46 of them actually adopt angels as well. Wow. So there's this I see a coming back, if you will, to somewhat of a normalcy in volunteering for us, at least. Now, workplace giving is a whole nother discussion. Right. I think that would take more time because it's interesting. There are companies here that have their own workplace giving programs, and then you have those that are through United Way or another type of giving platform. The ones who have their own programs have been solid. They've stuck in there. They expect to see us at the giving days when we're at the tables and all that. Again, it goes back to bringing their teams back together and getting back to a normal operation that also includes how we give and how we support community organizations.
I think that's great, Harold. I mean, like I said, I made a joke in the beginning about working from home and all you guys are all in an office. Like, I miss the human interaction, right? And so for all those organizations and those businesses that are working from home, it's time for them to bond, get together, support an organization like yours and Salvation Army, the Angel Tree, and everything else, just getting out there. And I think, for us as nonprofit leaders, donors start off as volunteers and they start out listening to our story. And I think that journey is important. So I appreciate you sharing that. Christy, we're talking about relationships. And so building off of that, face-to-face must be the foundation of any of our fundraising programs. One of the areas of your expertise is helping high net worth individuals meet their philanthropic goals that include a variety of different giving vehicles, such as donor advice funds and charitable trusts. Based on the current giving trends, what recommendation would you give for organizations just to execute a major gifts program and create that donor-centric engagement?
Really look at where your major gifts are coming from. Look at the check. If it's coming from Fidelity or a National Philanthropic Trust or something like that, it's coming from a donor advice fund, and there's more money there. And it gives you a clue that they're a little bit more sophisticated. Mm-hmm. They get it. They're probably giving with assets as opposed to income. So there's probably even more money than there normally would be, especially in these types of times. I just had a conversation with a family a couple of weeks ago, and we were looking at their portfolio and we needed to rebalance. And look, Apple stock is at a 52-week high. We've got a large concentration. Let's, sell that. And we were like, well, why don't, are philanthropic. Why don't we put it in a donor advice fund? And they're like, oh, great, let's do it. So, those conversations are happening. And, when Marco was talking about family foundations, add donor advice funds to that. Mm-hmm. Conversation as well. The donor advised fund that I set up for this client is actually called the X Family Foundation. So it's very hard to figure out, is this a private foundation? Is this a donor advised fund? Is this an LLC that they've set up for just charitable purposes? What is this? So dig a little and figure that out. And then also I would say, given some frustrations at the end of last year, make sure that you have your information on your website about how to make stock gifts, please. I had 3 organizations lose out on getting stock gifts because the information wasn't there and there was nobody in the office to return phone calls. So the stock went into a donor advised fund and it hasn't gone to the organizations yet. So, make it easy for your people for your donors to give as well. And, for their advisors to really help them. And again, one thing with donor advised funds too, that I think a lot of people don't realize is they all have succession plans. And that's really a plan giving vehicle. So talk to your donors who are using donor advised funds. What's happening with your succession plan? Because they can give gifts outright to organizations through that succession plan, in addition to, leaving it to their children or whatever they want to do. So.
Great feedback, Christy. Christy, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. And every organization I've been at, I've always tried to figure out a way to make it frictionless giving for the donor. How to remove as many steps. How many clicks does it take to get to the donate page? How many organizations don't put contact information for fundraisers on their websites? How to give mobile mobile payments. And you're talking about stock and all the different opportunities. People want to give in different variety of ways, but let's take away all those steps. Fantastic advice for all things giving. Abigayle, I want to lean into focusing on this idea of responsive fundraising. As you know, it's all about listening to our donors and prospective donors and engaging them in meaningful and engaging ways to get them engaged. As the donor pipeline continues to shrink, what improvements or changes would you recommend to fundraise responsively and better steward and therefore retain these existing donors to make it easier for these smaller gifts that one might actually become major donors we're leading into?
Sure. So I think segmentation is still going to be a leading way that we mark our donor records to listening to what their philanthropic goals are or what their passions are that are fulfilling our mission. But then also setting up our automations to support those. I was really amazed when we started setting up our new donor series and our new email subscriber series, just the open rates and the click rates we were getting. I think for many years as fundraisers, we assumed that once someone donated is because they understood our story and our mission, and then they wanted to support it. And I think what we're really seeing is that there are some donors who are willing to make that first gift and then learn more about us and then continue to build that relationship. And so really thinking through that first 6 months, 18 months of what your donor or new email subscriber might experience and how we can learn and build more and understand more about that donor's goals through that process. I think it's going to become more important that we give direct storytelling to our frontline staff and be able to capture those. We have some great technology partners to help us with that. But, the iPhone and the technology we hand our staff, that really helps us with that storytelling. It doesn't always have to be bringing in a film crew to make the glossy trifold and the glossy video for the gala. There's still parts of that. That's still part of our video and digital strategies. But there's some real great materials and stories and impact lessons that come from just asking your staff to take pictures when they go to ice cream with residents or the folks that they're serving or the back of their car filled with gifts. It doesn't always have to be the faces. It can be that story and that impact and progress. And then I always advise people fundraisers to give themselves room to fail and to try new things. So I think we have to be building in the fundraising culture. The part of our budget is trying a different direct mail approach, a different acquisition list, a different technology partner, just to start testing those waters and seeing if that's the right fit for our donor. We tend to rest on what has worked in the past. And we as fundraisers, as a field and as nonprofits need to start stepping out and saying, well, what could work next year? What are we going to give ourselves that room to not always be perfect, but to be authentic?
Such great advice. I mean, we all had success, but we all had failure in that. And I think like the key concept I keep hearing, I go to a lot of conferences and I do a lot of speaking for our organization, and I hear a lot of things. It's the idea of failing forward. Right. And I think we have to try new things. We have to be able to lean in and we have to be able to do it. But again, I think I heard from all of you guys. You guys all laid in the idea about generosity, gratitude, personalization, and like just communication to our donors. I'd like to ask as the panel, just as a free reign, if you will, what do you think are the one or two key takeaways from this year's Giving USA findings? Anything jump out at you guys?
I'll just jump in. And I'll just say that to me, that shift in foundation giving is something I intuitively knew, but to just see it in such a bold number. And even if you set aside family foundations as its own kind of individual entity, I think it just summarizes to me how much more sophisticated our donors are becoming. And if you think about the type of fundraiser that can work successfully with a professional foundation, that's kind of what all of our fundraisers need to start to be like, right? It's showing impact, it's showing accountability. It's really leaning into deadlines, leaning into outcomes-based giving. It's all of those things. And I know at the end of the day, whether it's a professional foundation or a family foundation, it's still an individual who's making the decision. So we can't lose sight of those, building those personal relationships as well. And then I guess the other piece is this transfer of wealth, this $30 trillion, huge number. It's a T. But what it means to me is we just have to be really always thinking about the next generation and don't like set back and be comfortable with kind of how things were. We got to think about how things are going to be.
Love that, Kevin. Harold, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say similar to what Kevin was talking about, the transfer of wealth and just being prepared for that. We've been trying to be prepared
idea, right? We heard that a lot.
Yeah, but the other part of this is the report tells us that what we were thinking 2 years ago was true. We were on a wave and it was going to end at some point, and how much we prepared for that was going to determine how well we looked coming out of it. Yeah. And so we tried to prepare for that by putting a little money to the side when we knew the grants were going to start trickling down. We tried to prepare for that by talking more to our major donors. And we tried to prepare for that by creating a mid-level donor position that was focused on mid-level donors and how we're upgrading and cultivating them into major donors. And then the last piece is new donors, being more intentional with our new donors and how we receive them in their first gift. That is one of the biggies for us right now. How are we receiving that first gift and how are we responding to them on that first gift, particularly $100 and up gift? You know, what are we doing with those $100 new donors?
Kind of like what Abigayle said earlier is like the test gift, right? These donors are testing us to see, right?
I think I am most motivated by a lot of the research we're seeing in the DAF field about how some donors are using it as just an annual fund vehicle to minimize their administrative burden, while others are looking at a 5, 3, 5, 7 year philanthropic journey, and others are using it as part of their planned giving and estate planning and legacy giving. And for so many years, I think as fundraisers, we haven't recognized those differences or really understood those different perspectives. So I'm looking forward to really being able to work differently with different family foundations, different DAFs, depending on what their strategies are. And then I get a real joy when we start building multi-generational relationships with our families that support our organization. We talk about the Verlin family because we care for people with very complex disabilities. And we invite our donors that they're part of that family. And when we go to golf outings and there's multiple generations there, or we have a gala or a parade or a carnival, and we see bringing of the children and bringing of the next generation celebrating with our older donors, that brings a joy to us as well as part of that Verlin family. So we look forward to the continued growth of the Verlin family, but also understanding that building relationships with that next generation of decision makers.
Great. Thank you so much, Abigayle. Marco?
Yeah, just kind of will co-sign with what folks are saying, but kind of I think what I learned from the Giving USA study is just that we're going to have to walk and chew gum and find new ways to walk and chew gum, which is essentially what you have your big donors, your major donors that are becoming more sophisticated with giving vehicles like family foundations, donor advised funds, and then you have a shrinking donor base at the lower levels. And so, we have to get more sophisticated with how we interact with the foundations, and then we also have to figure out how to scale stewardship and relationship building at the lower level, because we got to keep growing that pipeline. And I think kind of what the suggestions that Harold made, particularly with first-time donors, is a big one. Also, repeat donors. If you're not, if you have donors who are giving 5 years in a row, 10 years in a row, are you sending them something special, something that points out that they are committed donors? But that first gift is, you'll see I don't know if it's still true, but I know that in the past, retention rates among first-time donors was on an average like 20%. But then if you get someone to repeat their donation, they can jump up to 40 or 60% retention rate. So just by getting someone to make their second gift, you exponentially increase the opportunity to increase their lifetime value. So walk and chew gum.
Love that. Christy, you're on mute. The quote of the pandemic.
There we go. I knew somebody was going to have to do it. Why not me? So I think, what's really fascinating to me that I saw is, as Rasheed Wallace, who's an NBA player, used to say, the ball don't lie. Look at the S&P 500 and where it goes, and it tracks giving. All the time. If the market's up, it's going to be a good year. If the market's down, it's going to be a slower year. And so just, keep that in mind as you go forward.
Love it. Thank you so much, Christy. The key thing, a lot of things. I'm a data geek and I love Giving USA and I love the Institute. And I love what we put together for nonprofits. And the couple of things that jumped out at me was, I dug deeper into the report and, in my research, it's, 400,000 new nonprofits in the last 10 years in our space. We're tracking that through the 990s and the registration. So it's not competition. It's just more opportunity for individuals to support our community as well. Last year's report, the big thing for me was people were leaning into electronic giving, online giving increased from 5 to 13%. It increased another 5% this year. The Marco's comment about walking and chewing gum, figuring out what channel works for our donors. Is it donor advised funds? Is it mobile giving? Is all those different routes to make it easy for our donors to contribute. But thank you so much to our panel. Thank you for everybody else that's attending. I'm going to kick it over to Susan over at Lighthouse to wrap things up and put a nice little bow on this.
Thanks so much, Erik. And to you panelists, you guys are rock stars. I continue to learn so much every day, even though I've been doing this for a while. And I love the walk and chew gum, Marco. I probably will never forget that. So thank you all very much. We've been answering questions, of course, and we have one right now for Harold specifically. She's been waiting for a while, Harold, since this started with your very first comment. So she wanted to know how your team grew your digital giving so dramatically.
Well, actually, it was a plan that started 4 years ago. We were raising about $25,000 digitally. And then we put together a comprehensive, let me basically say, one of the keys to this was including digital on all of your appeals, including digital on all of your campaigns, your events. Our digital grew because we used it as a tool. To be honest, we put it in front of people as a way to give the gift in the moment, whether it be an event, whether it was at a kettle, wherever that was. But we had to be intentional about that. So we went from about a $25,000 to $30,000 to $500,000 in 2 years. And that was being intentional about what we were doing. And then we also did the thing you must do if you're going to learn is you partner with someone who knows what they're doing in digital. We had a company, I'll call it their G Lab. They're a great company, but they help us acquire new donors through digital emails and so forth. So we work with them with our materials. They send that stuff out, but you have to be intentional about including a digital option for every opportunity to give.
That's great. Thank you, Harold. Again, great advice. Make it easy for the donors, right? Perfect. Well, thank you, Erik, so much. We'll kick it back over to Harry.
All right. Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you, Una, and panelists and guests for all your participation today. We know you're very busy, and we're thankful for you sharing your time with us. Now, we're grateful to Virtuous for partnering with Lighthouse Counsel, certainly to bring your insight from giving global experts on philanthropy. It's certainly very important to everything that we do. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.